Hello, this is Dr. Rafael Gutierrez. Today I'm going to talk about the basics of tissue. Now, to understand tissues, you really have to go back to the basic cell, and so there is going to be a little review on the cell. So here's a picture of the cell again. If you remember, you have the phospholipid bilayer around the cell. It's made of phospholipids, proteins, cholesterol, sugars, and some of the proteins are going to go all the way through. Some of them are going to be peripheral. Inside you have the cytoskeleton, which gives the cell its shape. You have the rough endoplasmic reticulum, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi, the cytoskeleton, which I've mentioned, mitochondria, and you can see the nucleus here. Now, if you remember, the way the cell works is the nucleus holds the DNA, which has the code for all the proteins. The DNA will be copied into mRNA, leave the cell, and either be made by the free ribosomes, the ribosomes in the rough endoplasmic reticulum. If it's going to be excreted, meaning it's going to be outside, it'll go from the rough endoplasmic reticulum to the Golgi, and the Golgi will put it in vacuoles to allow the proteins to be sent out of the cell. Now, when we're dealing with tissues, we actually have a lot of different types of tissues, but pretty much in the most general form, they are tissue with some sort of, a tissue is pretty much the cell with some sort of extracellular matrix. So what is a tissue? Tissue is cells within a matrix, and cells are the living portion. The matrix is pretty much anything that is not cellular. That means it could be protein, it could be water, it could be ions, it can pretty much be anything. Now, there are four basic families of tissue. There's connective tissue, which is the one I'm going to deal with a lot towards the end. There's epithelial, endothelium, mesothelium. They're all going to be about the same. What they have is they're going to have a lot of cells, very little matrix, and usually this is what we're going to see on the top layer of skin, in the intestines, lungs. I'll show you those as we go along. Contractile, it's a tissue that contracts. There's only three tissues there, which we'll talk about later. And nervous tissue, it's tissues that are sending messages. Now, I will mention a lot of the images I borrowed from KenHub. I did email them and they said that it was fine as long as I mentioned that I use them. KenHub is a free site. You can pay to get a lot more. So I wanted to show you how tissues work, and the way I wanted you to do it is by looking at an organ. And the organ I'm looking at is skin. And what you see is the skin is here. This again is a KenHub picture. Skin total is here. It's part of the integumentary system. And if you look here at the names, you actually have the dermis. Dermis is the connective tissue layer here. So it's connective tissue. It's formed by the mesoderm, and it is a main connective tissue. Underneath it, you have the hypodermis, which is mesodermal in origin as well. It is connective tissue, and it has a lot of, pretty much has the type of tissue is called adipose, which we'll talk about later. And you can see it does have a lot more vasculature than the connective tissue, which I'll show you later. And then on top, we have the epithelial tissue. It is made from the ectoderm origin when we're dealing with skin, and it's going to have a specific look. So what happens is you have in skin, just this area here, you have three layers of skin, the organ, and you have different types of tissue in each layer. Over here, you actually can see that it has another layer below it, which we'll talk about when we get to it. So a lot of times we can actually start looking at the epithelial tissue by looking at cells. Now, there are four different types of epithelial tissues, but right now I will only talk about four. The first one is called the squamous tissue, and you can see it here, and it's a flat cell. Now, the reason you would want a flat cell like this is either because you're lining something, or you want to allow osmosis and diffusion to occur. In general bio, you talked about how osmosis is the movement of water through a semi-permeable membrane to even out the dissolved particles. And so if you want osmosis to occur from one side to the other, so from the top layer here through this, you're going to need a thin flat layer with a lot of surface area so it can go through. Diffusion, the movement of molecules from high to low concentration, will occur here too. And so this type of flat single cell layer tissue will usually be found in places where you want a lot of diffusion. But what I did just want to talk to you about is the cell structure. And so over here you can see that the cells are flat. So they're squamous cells. which means that they're flat cells. Another type is a cuboidal. Based on the name, cuboidal, it tells you it's cube-like. And so what you have is you have a basement membrane, the bottom layer, basement membrane here, and you have these cube shaped cells all along that. So those are cuboidal epithelium. And then you also have columnar epithelium, which you can see here have a nice long column shape. Basement membrane here again. And so this allows different things to occur in each one of the types of skin, each types of epithelium. And all these that I'm showing you here are one cell layer, so they're usually referred to as simple. But I'll show you a little bit more. Now, there's a lot of different classifications that we have. We can actually deal with simple, which are one cell layer, and we can have many layers, which are stratified. So over here, you can see the basement membrane here. This is skin. The epidermis is here. So the basement membrane is down here. Basement meaning bottom, membrane is a membrane. And you see all the cells here. Now, if you look here, you can see as you go up higher, the cells get flatter. So this is actually the area you want to look at when you're trying to find out what this type of tissue this is. So this is a many layered, so it's stratified squamous epithelium. This is actually a specialized stratified squamous epithelium, which has a thick layer of protein on top, which is called keratin. So keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. This picture is from KenHub. I borrowed it from them. And you can also have other things, such as cilia. And in cilia, you have these hair. And so this would be ciliated columnar epithelium. But if you notice the nuclei, they're actually in different levels. So it looks like it's stratified, but it's not, because basement membrane, only one cell layer. So it's pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Technically, it's ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Now, I actually want to go through the tissues. Now, if you look at this tissue, you have a lot of cells, and they tend to be flat. So this would be stratified, many layered, squamous, because it's flat, epithelium. The lumen is over here. So this would be a stratified squamous epithelium. These purple dots you see here would be the nuclei. Now, if you look at this, a lot of people panic when they see stuff, but you have to actually look at where the basement membrane is. In this area here, the basement membrane is around the side here. And so you can actually see it here a little better. Now, this is slightly modified, but if you look at some of the cells here, for instance, you do have a lumen in the middle. These technically would be a single cell layer from basement membrane, which is around here, to the lumen here. So it's simple, and these are actually the cuboidal cells. And there are different types of cuboidal cells, slight variations depending on what you see. This one's probably the best one you see. And so this is a simple cuboidal epithelium. Now, this tissue is actually important, and what you notice is you have these flat cells here, and there is space here. Now, this is actually located in the lungs. This is the alveolar tissue. And it's one flat cell layer, so it's simple squamous epithelium. The reason you want it flat is so you can have diffusion of gases from inside the lumen to blood vessels that would be on the opposite side. You can also see another type of tissue here, which is ciliated columnar epithelium, which I'll show you a better picture of later, like right here. You can see the cilia on here. You can see the basement membrane here, and these look like all the nuclei. There's a lot of layers, but in reality, there's actually only one layer here. So this is your stratified, they're pseudostratified. It has cilia, so it's ciliated, pseudostratified, and these are long cells, so it's columnar epithelium. The basement membrane is down here. Now, those are actually the epithelial tissues. There is one more, which is called transitional epithelium, which cells look like they go all over the place. They look almost random, and the reason it's transitional is because it stretches and comes back. That's usually seen in urinary system. And so switching over to connective tissue, this is the main types of tissue you have. And one of the things is most of them will have more matrix and cells. The two different ones are adipose, and blood looks like it because when we look at it, we're looking at a dehydrated version of blood. So the first one I want to talk about is what's a lot of people refer to as connective tissue proper. There's a lot of different types of connective tissue proper, and one of the first ones that I did want to mention is called mesenchymal connective tissue. And mesenchymal connective tissue is a embryological connective tissue which can really become almost anything. You then have your dense regular connective tissue, which is found on tendons and ligaments. When you look at a tissue, think of why it's found in certain areas. If it's found in tendons and ligaments, usually this means that they're going to want to cause a movement and not necessarily be too elastic. Dense irregular connective tissue is found in the dermis of skin, which I showed you the picture of skin. You have the epidermis. The dermis is dense irregular connective tissue. And you can see how elastic it is. If you take your skin, pinch it, and pull it, you can see how it has some elasticity, and it returns to its original shape relatively quickly because of the fluids within it. I'll mention more about that when we get into skin. You also have loose irregular, called areolar tissue, which is a kind of packaging type of tissue. It's usually between tissues, which we'll see a bit later. And we have elastic tissue, which is usually found in large arteries. And this is because as arteries go through pressure, they need to be able to not just stretch, but recoil. The elastic tissue helps the recoil, not to stretch. Now, one thing about this connective tissue, most of it, except for mesenchymal, are made from fibroblasts. Fibro means fibers, and usually we're dealing with collagen. Blast means maker, and cyte means cell. So if you talk about fibrocytes, they're cells that are in the cartilage, they're cells that are in the connective tissue. So I wanted to show you what the mesenchymal connective tissue look like first. And what you see is you see a lot of substance here, and you see the cells here, the nuclei, the purple. And so this is the mesenchymal. It can eventually become almost anything, almost any tissue. Now, I want you to name this tissue based on what we know. It is formed by fibroblasts, and these fibroblasts, you can see these dark nuclei which are squeezed in here. It has a lot of collagen, and you'll notice that there's not any blood vessels here, which means that it is avascular. One of the problems with this type of tissue is it tends to have a difficult time healing if it's overstretched or torn. If you don't know, you can see that the tissue here is really tight. The collagen fibers are really tightly bound, and they're in regular parallel arrangement. So this is dense, regular connective tissue. Now over here, we can see you have dense tissue here, but you can see that the arrangement is a lot more chaotic. You can see the fibroblasts here, and you can see that there's not much blood vessels. So this is a more irregular, so it's dense, irregular connective tissue, fibroblasts or fibrocytes here. Over here, you can see that this tissue is almost transparent. You can see some collagen fibers and some elastic fibers here. You can see some of the nuclei, which are going to be fibroblasts. And so this is a loose irregular or areolar connective tissue that I mentioned earlier. Now over here, you do have the elastic fibers. You do have smooth muscle here. And you can see that you have a thin layer of one cell layer cells here. So there's actually multiple tissues here. You have the simple squamous endothelium, smooth muscle, which we'll talk about later, and elastic tissue here. Now the next type of tissue I want to talk about is a family called cartilage. This one again is usually avascular, and it borrows blood from the surrounding tissues. It does have some of the ability to heal itself, but a lot of times when this is damaged, it will actually calcify or hypertrophy sometimes, causing changes in the structure. The cells that make it are called chondroblasts. If you notice, blast means maker, chondro means cartilage. So chondroblast is cartilage makers. And there are three types. You have hyaline cartilage, which is a main one, having a smooth, almost glassy appearance. And this is the one that's usually found between joints. It's smooth, so you can actually get movement in joints. And if this cartilage is damaged, a lot of times you can have small calcifications in it called spurs, and those will actually end up leading to osteoarthritis. Arthro means joint, itis means inflammation. So osteoarthritis is inflammation of the joint because it's been made into bone. You also have fibrocartilage, which is hard and has a lot of collagen fibers within it in parallel arrangements. This one's really important for weight-bearing joints and in structures that need to be held together in place with a special type of cartilage. So fiber cartilage, you'll see parallel collagen fibers in it. And elastic cartilage tends to be more flexible than either of the two. It has some elastic fibers within it, and it gives it a wool-like appearance. And it's usually found in the ears, the epiglottis, and part of the nose. I'll show you these in a little. Now, these are roots that you need to know when dealing with cartilage. Chondro, know that means cartilage. Blast, again, means maker, and site means cell. The other thing is you have these little holes in the tissue called lacunae, and it's important to know that because there are structures that you can see within the tissue. So over here you have this glassy appearance, smooth, which I will tell you, this is really smooth, and it usually allows bones to slide together without too much damage. So this is your hyaline cartilage, that glassy appearance. And you can see this cavity here, which is a lacunae, and you can see the little purple dots within the lacunae, which is the nucleus of the chondrocytes. Over here you can see the arrangements of fibers actually going in parallel. This is really good for weight bearing. You can again see the lacuna, that hole, and you can see in here the nucleus of the chondroblast. So these parallel fibers is what tells you that this is fiber cartilage. As we move on, you can see this wool-like appearance over here. You can still see the lacunae, and you can see the chondrocytes inside this. Again, anytime you see these big chondrocyte inside the lacunae, you know it's going to be cartilage, and as it looks kind of like a wool structure, this is your fiber cartilage. This is your elastic cartilage. Now, the other tissue that we actually can move on and look at is bone tissue. It is highly vascular, and it gives human bodies a shape. It is made of proteins such as collagen a lot of times. Most of it is collagen, and you have calcium phosphate crystals. This is where the body stores excess calcium and phosphate. If you need calcium, you can actually bring it out from the bones. Most of the tissue will be called osteo or osseous. If you think of osteoarthritis, osteo means bone, arthritis joint. Osteoporosis, osteo again bone, porosis porous, so porous bones. So the cells that make it are osteoblasts, and they can actually make it by making proteins and binding calcium and phosphate to it. That way it makes it harder and stronger. Osteocytes will end up doing it once the bone is made. Osteoclasts will take calcium and phosphate from the bones and move it to the blood. And so if you need calcium or phosphate in the blood, you will use osteoclasts to break down bone. Now, over here you see the compact osseous tissue. And you'll see these nice round circular patterns around that look like trees. These circular structures are called concentric lamella. Lamella are layers, so they're concentric layers that come around. This actually gives the bone its strength. One of the interesting things about bone, it's roughly about 3 times stronger than steel of its own weight. Inside here you can see something called a central canal, which is where blood vessels and nerves go through. So bone does have a lot of blood vessels, and you can see that there's a lot of lines where the osteocyte is embedded in here, and they have extensions through the concentric lamella trying to get the nutrients. Those extensions are called canaliculi, or little canals. And so this is actually what compact bone. Now, one thing I will tell you is if you look at whole bone, you usually have 2 layers, the outside and the inside. The outside layer is called the cortex, and that's what's made out of compact bone. The inside is the medulla, and that has medullary bone, which is called spongy bone, which I'll show you now. So over here you can see the spongy bone. You can see it tends to go everywhere. The reason it's called spongy is not because it is soft, but rather because it goes everywhere. The other thing you can see is you can see marrow here and some lipid here, some adipose tissue here, which you will find in adult bone. You can see more here too. And so this is what spongy bone will look like. It still has the interstitial lamella, but it will not have the concentric, well, sometimes you will find some concentric lamella, but it's not as well defined as the other type of bone. Now, there are words to know when you're actually looking at bone. One is osteo, which should mean bone. Lacunae is still the hole where you find the cell, the osteocyte in this case. Canaliculites are the little canals between the lacunae going towards the central canal. Cyte means cell. Blast means maker. Clast is breaker. And the lamella are the layers. Now, we have another tissue that is important to look at, and that's your blood tissue. It is a connective tissue, and it contains many cells, but most of them will not have nucleus, unless the blood is in the red marrow, which is slightly different. And so I do want to show you how blood looks. One of the things you'll notice is most of the cells don't have nuclei. You do have a couple here, white cells, leukocytes, which are not going to have nuclei. These are your erythrocytes, or red blood cells here, and you notice they don't have nuclei. They have nuclei at the beginning when they're being made in the bone marrow, but as they develop, they lose the nuclei, and I'll mention more about that when we get into lymphatics and blood. The last tissue type I'm mentioning is your adipose tissue of the connective tissues. Adipose tissue is highly vascular. If you think of the hypodermis of the skin, that's actually where you have your adipose, a lot of your adipose tissue, not just there. The cells are called adipocytes. Adipo, fat, cyte means cell, and they do have large amounts of smooth endoplasmic reticulum and modified vacuoles, which is where they actually tend to store lipids. They don't stain too well because of the amount of fat in them. So if we look at this, I did take this image from KenHub. I modified it a little. You can see the phospholipid bilayer here, and you can see it doesn't stain too well. And you may see little dots here, which are nuclei. So this is a cell, nuclei is here. So each one of these is a cell. And the lipids are in here in the vacuole or smooth endoplasmic reticulum. The last tissue, well, there's two more tissue types that I'm going to talk about. And you'll notice that it is getting pretty, not too many slides left. And the last tissue type I'm going to talk about is contractile tissue. There are only 3 types of contractile tissue, regardless to what people tell you. Some tissues can contract, which means they'll pull away from something, but that actively contract based on based on your body wanting to contract, there's only 3. One of them is called striated skeletal muscle. It's a striped muscle, which is voluntary, and which means you can allow it to move. It has a lot of nuclei because when you're making this, these cells fuse together to form these long cylindrical tubes. And so you have a lot of nuclei, but you don't have any branches. Striated skeletal pretty much means striped skeletal muscles. So they're associated with your skeletal system. The next one, and I misspelled this, is striated cardiac muscle. It should be striated, not, I don't know what that says. Cardiac muscle, and it is again striped, and this one is involuntary, and it's only found in the heart. It can be either or binucleated. Sometimes I have seen some books that say trinucleated, and it has a lot of mitochondria. If you remember the cell, mitochondria needed a lot of oxygen to function, and so these cells use a lot of oxygen to maintain having a normal contraction. Again, these are involuntary. They also contain something called intercalated disc, which you can see on the slide as dark lines between the cells. Now, these do not necessarily, the striated cardiac muscles don't always fuse completely. They might be 1 or 2 cells fused together. And so you actually need a connection between the myocardiocytes, the striated cardiac muscle tissue. The last one is smooth muscle. And again, these are things that you can't control, usually found in your esophagus or your blood vessels. And they don't have striations, which means they don't have striped, and they do have a single nucleus. Most of the smooth muscle tend to have low levels of mitochondria. They tend to be slower contractions. So now that we talked about the tissue, I want you to pay attention to what you see here. You'll notice first thing, it's striped. You'll also notice that there's no branches. It goes straight here. You can go straight here. You can actually see the straight here. So he has a striped, non-branches, and a lot of nuclei. These purple dots are nuclei. So this would be your striated skeletal muscle. Over here, you can actually see that there is some stripes. You can see the stripes coming down here. And you can see these dark discs coming here. These are your intercalated discs. Always look for intercalated discs if you can see a tissue that's striped. And you can see that the nuclei, you have one or two nuclei. And if you look closely, you can see that some of these have branches. And so as these are branched, multinucleated, and have intercalated discs, these are your striated cardiac muscle. Now, there's a lot of tissues, and that's why I said name these tissues. Over here, you do have the smooth muscle. You do also have some elastic tissue around it. And you also, the smooth muscle is here. This is in an artery. You also see a flat cell here. This flat cell area here, elastic tissue here, is known as your simple squamous endothelium. It's lining the inside. You have the smooth muscle, and so you can see that in one cell type, and you actually technically have blood cells here, and so you can see how in one slide you can have multiple tissues, and that's why I left that on there. The last tissue, I got this thing from KenHub because it tends to stain it's really hard to stain, and the cells are modified in a way where you actually do have a lot of blood supply to it. You also have a lot of nerves here. So this is your nervous tissue, and you'll notice that they don't stain too well necessarily. So you can see the connective tissue that wraps around it. And so this here is nervous tissue. Now, if you were to draw the cell, you'd see that it has three areas, namely the dendrites, the soma, which is a cell body, and the axon. As we go into neuro, I will talk more about that. And so now you do have the basics of histology. My next presentation will be epithelial tissue, and so you will get a lot of the different structures within it. I hope you enjoy this and have a nice day.